An interview, a new baby, a big trip. There are always things we need to get ready for, things to plan, to buy, to save for. Who has a baby without having previously bought nappies, a cot, and probably a million extra just-in-case items? Who goes on a trip without passport, money, etc.? So why do most of us not prepare for the biggest event in our lives? The preacher we've been hearing from tells us what to prepare for and how. My first point is having a heart of wisdom. Verses 1 to 8 makes big contrast between what's better, between the end of life versus the beginning, celebration versus mourning, and wisdom versus folly. Wisdom is better than folly. Okay, makes sense. But there's a big surprise when we get to mourning and feasting, life and death. The preacher tells us that it's the end, particularly the end of life, which is the best thing to focus on. Death is something that most of us avoid thinking about or talking about. We come up with euphemisms to avoid the topic and feel shy and hesitant when confronted with the mourning of a friend. But the preacher says, no! Think about it. Embrace it. Lay it to heart. But why? Why is mourning and sorrow better than feasting and laughter? How is rebuke better than song? I know which one I'd choose, any day and twice on Sunday. And yet the preacher says this is the path of the wise. The heart of the wise is in the house of mourning, verses 4 and 5, listening to rebuke. In the Bible, one's heart is what motivates and drives us, like our epicenter or emotional control room, if you've seen that animation Inside Out. The core of who you are and what makes you, you. So to say their heart is there means that's where their attention and focus is. It feels very counterintuitive and a bit confusing. So what is and isn't this passage saying? It isn't calling Christians to live in a state of depression or to become goths. It isn't even saying that there's no place for feasting or laughter. We saw earlier in Ecclesiastes that there's a time for everything under the sun, and that includes celebrating and laughter. The preacher doesn't even say laughter's bad or celebration is bad, but it's described in verse 6 as hebel, meaning smoke or vapor, and translated here as vanity. It's an oft-recurring theme in Ecclesiastes. It means it's not enduring, and it's not the best. The best is yet to come. Don't allow your heart to be corrupted. Don't live focused on what this world can give. Parties, money, enjoyment. Be patient, says the preacher. Be wise. Let your reputation be good. Don't be corrupted. Keep your heart focused on the end game. Verse 8. Better is the end of a thing than its beginning. I don't know much Latin, but I sometimes say memento mori, a phrase which feels a bit Ecclesiastes. It's Latin for remember you must die. In previous generations, you might actually walk into a study in Europe and find a human skull just sat on someone's desk, as a reminder to keep death constantly in mind. It feels a bit extreme, but actually I'm not sure it's far off the preacher's intention for our focus. And both Moses and Jesus say similar things to the preacher. Moses wrote in Psalm 90, verse 12, "So teach us to number our days, that we may get a heart of wisdom." Jesus said in Matthew 6, verses 19 to 21, "Do not lay up for yourselves treasures on earth, where moth and rust destroy, and where thieves break in and steal. But lay up for yourselves treasures in heaven, where neither moth nor rust destroys, and where thieves do not break in and steal. For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also." Death teaches us to be wise in the way we live, to prepare for eternity. Thomas Boston said, In the day of his birth, he was born to die, but in the day of his death, he dies to live. And wisdom is not anger, verse 9. Be not quick in your spirit to become angry, for anger lodges in the heart of fools. It's another heart issue. Another imperative command follows this, in verse 10. Say not, why were the former days better than these? It's easy to look back with rose-tinted spectacles at the past, whether in our own lives or even in history, like the Beatles' hit song, Yesterday. But the life of a Christian faces forwards. Romans 13:11 says, our salvation is nearer to us now than when we first believed. Live today in the light of eternity, not yesterday. The preacher extols wisdom in verses 11 and 12. Wisdom in Ecclesiastes isn't just being clever or having a high IQ. The preacher means wisdom in the light of God, godly wisdom. And it's like money in the bank, only better. It helps us with preparing for and facing death. It guards us against folly and anger, gives us a long-term view of God's plans, his work, while we're on this earth living under the sun. And if we live by wisdom, it preserves our lives all the way to eternity. So be wise. Know where you're heading and set your heart on getting there. Seek the rebuke of the wise, as verse 5 says. When was the last time you asked a godly person for advice in your life? I was shocked when the pastoral worker of a large church told me that it was rare for someone to ask her for advice on something. Listening to the constructive criticism of a godly friend can help us to prepare for eternity. So have a heart of wisdom. Go to the Bible and the godly for life-giving correction. My second point is live in the light of God's work. Live in the light of God's work. The preacher now tells us to consider the work of God in verse 13. Who can make straight what he has made crooked? In Ecclesiastes chapter 1, verse 15, he has already told us, what is crooked cannot be straightened, and what is lacking cannot be counted. So the answer is nobody. It is God himself who put the crook in crooked. Now I'm a perfectionist, and I like things to be under my control. I desperately want the crook to be ironed out of the crooked. I don't like it when things go wrong and are painful. And yet, the preacher is right. No matter how hard I try, I can't get the crookedness out of life. Physical limitations, money troubles, relationship breakdowns, all the things we wish were different. Verse 14 says, in the day of prosperity be joyful, and in the day of adversity consider, God has made the one as well as the other, so that man may not find out anything that will be after him. God has made it so both sides of the better than that we looked at before will happen to us. We will experience both the laughter and the mourning, the suffering and the good times. We will see a lot of injustice. Verse 15, in my vain, it's that smoky Hebel mist word again. In my vain life I have seen everything. There is a righteous man who perishes in his righteousness, and there is a wicked man who prolongs his life in his evil doing. Even when we're wise, we live here on earth under the sun, which alternately kisses us with its warmth and kills us with its glare. We can't stop sin, and we can't stop death. We can't iron out the crookedness. We don't know what's next in our lives, and we don't know what will happen to our loved ones or our dreams once we die. We need to understand our situation in terms of God's sovereignty. Who put the crooked in? God. Then not only is it impossible for us to change it, but it helps us know how to respond to the days of prosperity or adversity, with God in the picture, with our present and our future in His hands. Do we just talk a lot about God's sovereignty? Or do we live wise lives that reflect a trust in it? The preacher has told us a lot about wise living, and now he makes an odd statement that appears to contradict what he said before. Verse 16, "Be not overly righteous, and do not make yourself too wise. Why should you destroy yourself?" I take the position here that this overly righteous person is one who is only pretending to be righteous. Maybe the person who talks about God's sovereignty, but doesn't live a life that reflects it. I lived in Brazil many years, and they have a common expression, "Ninguém merece," or "nobody deserves that misfortune." Actually, we do. None of us are so righteous that we only deserve to receive blessings. Don't think too much of your own goodness or righteousness and get cross with God when things go wrong. So there's a temptation to be a Pharisee, and there's a temptation to go the opposite way and to give way to sin. In verse 17, "Be not overly wicked, neither be a fool. Why should you die before your time?" Sure, everyone sins, as we'll examine later in verse 20. But sin leads to death, and there's a great difference between a repentant sinner and one who gives themselves over to a lifestyle of sin. The preacher really wants us to understand these things, to live wisely fearing God. This godly wisdom will give us incredible strength to live life under the sun, more than 10 rulers in a city. He shows us that along with the fallen, crooked world we live in, we also are fallen in verses 20 to 22. "Surely there is not a righteous man on earth who does good and never sins. Do not take to heart all the things that people say, lest you hear your servant cursing you. Your heart knows that many times you yourself have cursed others." We are all guilty sinners with the angry heart of fools. So what do we do? Listen to the preacher. Set your heart wisely on the end game, not the hebble, smoky, wispy elusiveness of the good times this world offers. One day the crooked will be made straight. We know that from Luke chapter 3, verses 5 to 6, when he quotes the prophet Isaiah, referring to Jesus making the crooked straight. "Every valley shall be filled, and every mountain and hill shall be made low, and the crooked shall become straight, and the rough places shall become level ways, and all flesh shall see the salvation of God." We may not know what's next in our lives under the sun, but we certainly know our future with Christ. Praise God when things go right, and trust God when things go wrong. Both come from Him. Maybe we'll never understand the crooks in our lot, but God knows why He's put them there. And if God's done something crooked in your life, would you still change it? Or will you wait for Him to make the crooked straight? Have a heart of wisdom and live in light of God's work.